Isn't it?
1% of the country.
Crikey. Is it? What about all the football players?
Well, not many football players, are there?
Oh, well, we're the lucky ones, then, aren't we? Mind you, we've blooming well worked for it.
Yeah.
So our perspective is all wrong.
Having the wrong perspective has real political impact. When we tell politicians to tax the rich, we mean other people, never us. And we overestimate how many there really are.
There aren't enough rich to fund the sorts of expenditures that need to be funded. I mean, I'm not poor, but I don't regard myself as rich. I regard Russian oligarchs as rich. Everybody has their own idea of who the rich are, and they're always someone else.
And it's them that should pay
And
rather
it's them
than
that
us.
should pay, yes.
At Westminster, politicians attempted to pander to voters' perceptions of who can afford to pay more tax, whilst also having to confront reality. Let's take a look at who pays what when it comes to income tax. This is the total amount raised in income tax last year. So how much do those on the lowest 10% of incomes contribute to that? That's people whose incomes are up to about £10,000 a year. That's going to include part-time workers, some pensioners and students. That group contributes just 0.5% of the income tax total. In fact, the first 90% of income tax earners contribute less than half of all the income tax collected. This means that all of the rest is paid for by the top 10% of earners alone. That's those earning more than £48,000 a year, people like police inspectors and some senior teachers and the like. What about the richest 1%? Now, if you include not just salary, but income from savings and shares and other assets, we're talking people earning more than £153,000 a year. And that top 1%, just over 300,000 people, pays around 27% of all the income tax. That is a consequence of growing inequality. As the rich earn more and more, they pay a greater and greater share of income tax. More than enough, they may think, but others say, not nearly enough. After 30 years in which income tax rates only went down, it's not been easy for politicians, whatever their instincts, to put it back up. It wasn't until the global financial crisis of 2008 that raising the top rate of tax got back on the agenda. Even when the banks were crashing round our ears, when the taxpayer was shelling out for them, when anger about bankers' bonuses was at its height, a Labour government, led by Gordon Brown, 2 decades after Nigel Lawson's budget, still agonised about whether it could get away with increasing the top rate of tax. But the crash had blown a vast hole in public finances, which had to be plugged with tax rises and spending cuts. Anyone earning over £150,000 a year would pay the new top rate of income tax.
In order to help pay for additional support for people now and to invest in the future, I've decided that the new rate will be 50% and will come in from April next year, a year earlier.
The Chancellor considered promising that it was a temporary tax rise, but that's what they'd said when income tax began. Ever since, there have been loud calls to scrap the 50p rate. The debate about how much to tax the incomes of the rich is now not really focused on how much money can be raised, but what it says about Britain. Those who want to keep the top rate of tax at 50p argue it's a symbol of fairness, of shared pain in difficult times. Those who want to see it gone say that the rate acts as a kind of warning sign over Britain, over London, saying to the wealthy, you're not welcome here. That's a fear shared even by the man who introduced that new top rate. And he fears something else too, that it suggests that Labour is still a high-tax party. Was it crossing a Rubicon?
Yes, it was. I felt it was crossing a Rubicon because it was changing our whole philosophy as New Labour. Was a different economic approach, that we were to encourage people, encourage aspiration. That meant to have a competitive tax rate, something that was realistic, to encourage people to get on. It was sending a broader political signal, if you like. Now, this was changing it.
If putting it up was difficult for Labour, cutting it now is a headache for the coalition. Liberal Democrat David Laws was George Osborne's deputy at the Treasury. The politics now makes keeping the top rate much easier than scrapping it.
I think that 50% is too high. Half of somebody's income is a hell of a lot for we in government, for the state to take, however rich they are. But I'm absolutely clear that while we are in the middle of this necessary process of government austerity, while we're imposing huge burdens on people across society, it would be absolutely nuts to be seen to be a government that was prioritising the richest 1% of the population.
The rich aren't exactly lining up to offer to pay more tax on their income. To many, having to hand over more than half what they earn to the government crosses a psychological pain barrier. So politicians faced with the political, with the practical difficulties of getting more money that way have turned increasingly not to the rich, but to the, well, comfortably off. I'm heading to the seaside town of Southport in Lancashire. I'm going to meet a family classified as comfortably off, wealthy enough to pay not the top rate of tax, but the so-called higher rate, 40 pence in the pound, levied on earnings over £44,000 a year. Kat Sumner earns nothing. She's a full-time mum, bringing up 4 children. Although her husband Neil earns about £49,000 a year, they feel far from comfortable. In fact, they feel stretched. Some people will hear 49,000 and think, that's a lot of money. That's a lot more than we earn.
Yeah, and I understand that. I understand how people feel about that. But, I mean, I don't think they really understand how far that really goes when you've got to think about 6 people paying for their food, paying for their clothes, housing them all. I have to try quite hard to make ends meet.
Instead of putting up tax rates, politicians have classified more and more people as higher rate taxpayers, dragging more families into the net. The number of families like Kat's paying 40% has trebled in the past 30 years.
Don't know now.
The tax bandings have been very static compared to people's incomes. As people's incomes rose and rose, the tax bandings stayed pretty much where they were, and therefore brought more people into paying 40% tax rate. That whole situation is really unfair.
With so many ordinary families now paying the higher rate of tax, it's become even harder for politicians to increase their tax rate. Instead, the government's forced to claw back cash from them in other ways.
We will withdraw child benefit from households with a higher rate taxpayer. When the debts left by Labour threaten our economy, when our welfare costs are out of control, this measure makes sense.
It's my only income as a person, and when it was taken away, it made me feel really like, this is us saying there is no value in what you do. We don't value anything about you, who you are, or what you do.
The plan to cut Kat's child benefit inspired her to start a local campaign against the cuts.
I've got a few things here explaining about some of the cuts that are being made, and then there's
She wants the better off to pay more, and certainly doesn't think of herself as belonging to that group.
Have wheelchairs.
In terms of tax, you don't want to pay any more.
It's not that I don't want to pay any more. I feel that people should be responsible and take pride in paying their taxes, but I feel like we haven't got any more to give.
That feeling, which many people share, is what tempts politicians to promise tax cuts, even when there simply isn't the money to pay for them. There are now 3 million higher rate taxpayers, but 10 times that number pay the basic rate, so cutting that has long been the holy grail. The idea of cutting income tax has held politicians, whether Conservative or Labour, in its spell for 3 decades. When Gordon Brown delivered his last budget just weeks before moving next door on Downing Street to number 10, he was determined to prove that he too was a new Labour figure. What better way of doing that than cutting the basic rate of income tax? And you know, for a while, it all seemed to go so well.
To reward work, to ensure working families are better off, and to make the tax system fairer, I will from next April cut the basic rate of income tax from 22 pence to 20 pence.
But, you know, everybody, you know, likes to sit down to a cheer. But, you know, this is a case where if you're going to change the tax system in a big way, for goodness sake, ask yourself, you know, is this too good to be true?
I commend this budget to the House.
Because the answer is, yeah, it probably is too good to be true.
Problem for David Cameron to follow this, which he'll be doing in a moment?
Dire, he said that it was worse than changing nappies. A Labour Chancellor, who they've said is a tax increaser, has suddenly, with about 30-second notice, said, there, a 2p cut on income tax. He doesn't know what we don't know. Who is paying for that 2p cut in the basic rate? We'll find out. What we did find out is that that income tax cut for some was being paid for by an income tax rise for some of the poorest taxpayers in the country. Gordon Brown had scrapped the lowest level of income tax, the 10p band. And he, like another Labour Chancellor, Dennis Healey, all those years ago, was greeted with howls of outrage. The problem this time is they were coming from his own supporters.
I'm afraid the real problem for us was there was an awful lot of people who bluntly were traditional Labour voters and certainly been with us you know, in support for the last 10 years, who suddenly found their income had dropped. And they're the ones who said, hold on, what have you done to us?
When Alistair Darling took over from Brown at the Treasury, he also took over the daunting problem of compensating those who'd paid the price for a good headline.
At a cost of £2.7 billion, I will increase the individual personal tax allowances by £600 to £6,000.
The eventual bill was closer to £6 billion, and it was politically costly too. Just 8 days after Darling's attempted salvage job, Labour lost a once-safe seat in a by-election in Crewe and Nantwich.
20,539.
This was not well managed at all. This was a political disaster, and it took a heavy toll.
The reality is that the biggest money spinner of all, income tax, has now become a dead-cert political loser. The political consensus that it was impossible to raise income tax meant that government simply couldn't raise enough money that way. There was, of course, a simple solution. Tax people's incomes, but do it with a tax called something different. National insurance. The government takes not only income tax from our pay packets, but also national insurance, which of course is paid by employers too. Is wise venture a wise venture? It's hard to keep track of how much we cough up, let alone where it goes. Thanks very much indeed. So, with some punters, I did a few sums. How much income tax do you think you pay?
2,000? 3,000? Oh my God!
How much do you think you pay in national insurance?
2,500?
2,500.
Wow. I need a pay rise.
Would you like to pay more tax, Kirsty?
No, I wouldn't actually.
You wouldn't?
No.
But if you had to have a tax rise, which would you rather it was income tax or national insurance?
I would prefer that it was national insurance.
Because?
Because I believe in the national health system, and I think it's far better to pay into that.
I think if they had to put one up, I'd prefer it to be national insurance.
Because?
Because I think that goes towards healthcare and things that I will need in the future.
So if they're going to put anything up, put up the national insurance. If I told you they're absolutely the same, income tax and national insurance, they pay for exactly the same things.
No.
That's just like wrong.
They do. Many of us may think that national insurance is not just another tax, but some kind of, well, insurance, paying exclusively for health and pensions. That was true once, now it's a fiction. Yet it's one which serves politicians well to maintain.
At the top, Mr. Brown, please.
In the budget of 2002, Gordon Brown, the Chancellor who'd pledged not to raise income tax, raised the tax on our incomes by putting up national insurance. The clever bit was the way he sold it to us.
We as a nation will have to spend more on health care. I believe it is right that when everyone, employees and employers, benefit from the insurance provided by the National Health Service, everyone who can should make a fair contribution.
Market researcher Deborah Mattinson had tested every key phrase in focus groups. Her job was to find a way to sell Gordon Brown's tax rise.
First off, it was about ring-fencing the money and saying this will go on the NHS, and that the NHS needed more investment, which people bought relatively easily, and it resulted in a tax rise that 8 out of 10 people supported and were in favour of, which I think is quite an achievement.
So finally someone had done it, come up with a popular tax rise. How did Gordon Brown do it? Well, first and foremost, by not calling it an income tax rise. Second, by making it seem to be for a very specific purpose. And thirdly, by linking it with the national religion, the NHS. But there's a sting in this tale. If the government thought it would get the credit for the spending produced by that tax rise, it was to be mistaken.
What we found, very frustratingly, was what we began to describe as I've been lucky syndrome. So people would say, you know, my local primary school is okay, but I've been lucky. Or I took my daughter to the A&E, we were seen in half an hour, but we were lucky. So in other words, when they started to see that change in their own lives, they didn't assume that this was happening all over the country.
And does that have an impact of undermining the ability of politicians to ask for more money to spend?
It completely undermined the ability, because basically people didn't feel that things had improved. What had happened to them, their experience, what they'd seen, was an isolated lucky fluke. I've been lucky.
And this could be one of the biggest problems of all for politicians trying to raise more tax on our incomes. Whatever the evidence, we never seem to think we're getting a bargain. How much do we get back in return for the taxes that we give to the government? Well, that depends, of course, on where we are on the income scale. Let's put all the households in the UK into 10 equal groups, starting with the poorest and moving up to the richest. This shows what households on average get from government. The higher the bar, the more the group gets in things like healthcare, education, pensions and benefits, pretty much everything the government spends its money on. As we go down the income scale towards the poorest, we see that on average, poorer households get slightly more from the government. No surprise there, because of course they get more in terms of benefits. But now let's add something. Let's see what happens when you add in how much people pay in tax. Above the line is what you're getting from the government. Below the line is what you're paying to them in taxes. For the first 6 groups, that's for 60% of all households on average.